Nick, thanks so much for joining us on the Global Performance Summit.
Oh, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So you are really interesting in the field in that you're, pursuing PhD in basically how we can become better coaches by feedback and communication. So can you kind of break down the two parts that we need to accomplish if we want to be great coaches and communicators?
Yeah, so when we look at coaching, we could talk about it in many different buckets. I think there's two critical ones that we can talk about today and then zoom in if you would. One is obviously the development of relationships, the development of behavior and behavior change, and how do we drive motivation, specifically intrinsic motivation. So if we think about relationships, motivation, and behavior upgrading, I can kind of put that into the psychological bucket. And that's a critical bucket because if you don't establish relationships, if you don't have trust, if you don't have effective communication, everything that we're going to talk about today is null and void.
Mm-hmm.
So in understanding that, I want to make sure that even though it's not going to be the center of our conversation, that the listeners understand how important that psychology, if you would, trumps motor learning. When it comes to assuming that you have a good relationship, you have good communication, and good trust between you and your clients, then we can talk about or ask the question, how do we optimize the learning of motor or movement skills? And when we talk about that, there are two really big buckets. Obviously, what we say before the movement and what we say after the movement. So we can think of those as instruction being the primer of the motor system, and feedback then being, if you would, the refinement of the motor system. And both of those areas are primarily driven, at least in what we're talking about today, through words, through communication. And thus my words and the way I process them need to make it into my client's brain. They need to understand and translate and apply it back to their movement. So instruction and feedback are the two big areas in terms of how we influence movement through language.
Yeah, and you have a pretty cool illustration where you break it down, the triangle, and basically the environment first is going to affect both the instruction and the feedback. Can you kind of break down what we need to first think about when we're in a coaching environment and in the gym and how we even set up our sessions that way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So if we add a third layer, and then I'm going to answer that, from instruction and feedback, those being two huge motor learning principles. The third one then would be what we like to call practice design. So that's really what we're getting at here. So when we talk about how movement emerges, at least biologically, there are three major driving factors. And everything we're going to discuss today is how we influence those factors. One of them is the body. So obviously you're dealing with physical constraints. So if someone lacks mobility or stability or strength, that is going to directly influence how their body self-organizes or coordinates movement. We also know that the way the body organizes movement is based on two other variables of the task, being one of them. So what's being asked of me? Am I asked to run? Am I running on flat ground? Am I running on inclined ground? Is it soft? Is it hard? All of the different variables around the task influence how the movement forms itself. And then finally, the third one is the environment, as I already alluded to. What kind of surface, what kind of footwear? Is it sunny outside? Is it raining, right? If I'm playing a sport, does it have equipment, right? What are the literal environmental factors? So we know then that movement emerges based on physical constraints within our body relative to the task that I'm being asked to perform in terms of the environment that I'm being asked to perform it in. Thus, there's two different ways to influence that. We can influence that directly through words and language and interaction with the person itself, or we can manipulate the task. We can manipulate the environment, and that creates two buckets of learning that we call implicit learning, simply learning through experience, learning through engaging with the environment, learning through trial and error, or explicit learning, whereby we are given very specific information, and that information is meant to go into our thought process and how we go about moving. Thus, if we back up, instruction and feedback are explicit teaching tools, right? And practice design, how we manipulate task and environment, those are implicit learning tools. And using those two tools together in an eloquent way is how we really drive motor learning.
That's good. Can you talk about practice variability and even, in the strength coaches world, I guess it'd be a little bit more, the session variability. How are we varying our exercises or our cueing? Can you talk about that a little bit? And I think the interesting thing too that you've referred to a lot is contextual interference, which is actually trying to make sure they do it differently so that they can be more aware of what they're actually doing.
Yeah. So, variability is a term that's ubiquitous. We hear it all the time in our industry. And to be fair, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So let's first talk about the phenomenon of movement variability. Okay. So when biomechanical analysis was emerging, there was a researcher named Nikolai Bernstein. And you hear his name quite a bit if you're studying motor learning. And he had one famous study where he looked at people that deal with steel and creating various things out of steel. And they had to hammer the steel, obviously, at very high temperatures to mold it. And in doing so, in analyzing these people, what he realized was no two repetitions were ever the same. So he coined the term repetition without repetition. Now, what he noticed was something quite unique in that every time they would hit the steel, they hit it at the same exact point. So the end point, the result, had very low variability. But if you looked at angular velocity, the angle of the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, the variables that made up, if you would, the movement process, those were highly variable, meaning there could be a different elbow position, which then would be counteracted by a change in velocity or angle. So we have then what's called, from this, movement redundancies. And all we need to understand about movement redundancies is the body is built in a way where we can achieve the same outcome many, many different ways. And when we look at elite performers, whether it's an Olympic lifter interested in bar path, it's a baseball player interested in the position of the ball in the catcher's mitt, if it is a tennis player or a golfer interested in how they strike the ball, there's certain aspects of that they want to see no variability in, right? They want the ball to go to the same spot. They want to strike the ball in the same spot. They want the bar path to move in the same manner. But what we have to understand is the body's ability to do that is nested in its inherent ability to have variability in achieving that same outcome. And what we know is, as athletes or those learning a skill that involves coordination, as they get better at that skill, we see less variability in the outcome, but we see greater variability in those degrees of freedom that are redundant to one another. So the reason I'm spending time sharing that is when we hear about movement variability in motor learning, you don't need to do anything. It's already happening in the system. So we understand that variability is inherent to the learning process. Now, Chris, you asked the question around how do we then purposely use variability to drive this process? How do we use variability in the environment, variability in the task to drive the learning process? Well, here's how I want people to think of that. When a person is initially learning a skill, a boring skill, a march, a skip, a bench press, a squat for that matter, we don't need to be fancy. Here's why we don't need to be fancy. They've never done it. It's already novel to them. The environment in its basic form already contains enough variability and enough requirements around problem solving because they've never solved that problem. Now, once someone has gained, let's say, mastery in a squatting pattern, okay, well, now we have some options to load it differently. We can use kettlebells and do a goblet. Maybe we have two kettlebells. Maybe we're holding one kettlebell on one side to asymmetrically load. Front squat, back squat, that's fine. But understand this, the second we introduce a new implement, we open up a new box of variability. Thus, we don't need to be necessarily changing the loading parameter or the movement variation itself so often, unless your goal is simply, as one might say, to cause muscle confusion and metabolic inefficiency. And in that case, your goal is maybe body fat composition changes. What I'm talking about is motor learning. So I want people to be understanding is that variability is inherent to the system, that once we see a certain level of mastery, we can then introduce progression, which in its own right introduces new variability and continues to drive the learning process forward. Because as far as we're concerned today, efficiency equals no learning. Once someone has stabilized in a pattern, there's no longer any intrigue, if you would, for the motor system. So if we want further development in that pattern, variability is the currency then of learning. But variability just as easily could be classified as progression. So I don't want people to think that it has to be something that is involvement of putting someone on a Bosu ball and throwing medicine balls at them. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but we don't have to go to those extremes. Now, Chris, you asked another specific question around contextual interference. So when we talk about the weight room, I think what I just shared there is basically good, food for thought around the weight room progression and using it in a very specific manner. When we talk about learning skills like sprinting or even sports skills, let's say like throwing a baseball, or hitting a baseball for that matter, there's something called contextual interference. And basically the goal of contextual interference is to make sure that your motor system never goes into this, if you would, state of homeostasis, that it is constantly being challenged, and thus there is increased attentional focus on the task being learned, right? You can think of contextual interference like me playing with my 1-year-old son. He likes to have a toy in his hands for about 30 seconds. So I have to keep giving him a new toy to keep his attention focused on the task, which might be not bothering my wife while she's on the computer. So contextual interference in a learning context is no different. In that, let me use baseball because it's the easiest example for people to understand. If I'm a batter and all I get is fastballs over and over again, pretty soon I don't have to guess that it's a fastball. I already know it's a fastball. So a lot of the decision making that would precede me swinging the baseball bat is done for me, which means my attentional focus on the process itself has gone down. Thus, there's not as much learning occurring. Conversely, if I am receiving a fastball, a curveball, a changeup, and those are coming in a random order, I can never subtract that first part. I have to be focused on the pitcher. I have to try to, at an implicit level, pick up on the earliest sign that, hey, it's a fastball, it's a curve, it's a changeup. Thus, my attentional focus is more invested. There's more learning resources going into the process. Thus, greater learning occurs. And one might argue, well, Nick, isn't that baseball anyhow? Exactly. Contextual interference contains the purposeful variability that is inherent oftentimes to the sport that contains the skill one is trying to learn. So we touched on a lot of points there, but hopefully people know variability is inherent to the system. The use of variability is critical to scaffolding learning. Variability does not need to all of a sudden push to the extremes of circus act. And variability in the context of contextual interference, rotating through skills more often, creates more intrigue, creates more attentional investment, and attentional investment is the currency of learning.
Now, when it comes to learning a new skill, you obviously don't want to be constantly interfering with that athlete's ability to learn the new skill. So how do you balance that seeming randomness with them being able to master that skill?
Brilliant question.
Or begin to master that skill, rather.
Brilliant question. So that question was asked by a researcher named Jared Porter just a couple years ago. Because when contextual interference research first emerged, it basically looked at doing the same thing over and over again, so like just receiving fastballs, or having it completely randomized, where fastball, changeup, and curves were coming at you. And what we know is this: when they simply look at doing the same thing over and over again versus random practice, for a novice, right? They've never learned this skill before. We know that contextual interference allows for a more robust learning platform. They get better at the skill at a faster rate and a more consistent rate than the person that does the same thing over and over again. But someone said, well, shouldn't there be some level of progression to this? And that was Jared Porter. So he took a group of individuals, had one group do block practice, same thing over and over again, like many coaches do when they're first teaching kids or even adults for that matter. Another group did random practice. So rather than doing the 3 skills one at a time, they had them randomized together. And then another group did block practice for the first portion of time and then random practice for the second portion of time. So there was some progression there. And what they found, as I think would be intuitive to most of us, is progression beat the other two, but random practice was still better than block practice. So here's what we know from that then. If you want learning to occur, having a certain level of interference and variability in the task environment just allows for more attentional investment and better learning. But we can see the rate with which someone learn work better when there's progression, meaning you give them some block practice. You let them practice the same skill over and over again so that they get some context. They pick up on critical attributes of the movement. Maybe they pick up on critical features of the environment that drive the decision to swing the baseball bat or cut left or right, whatever it might be. Once they've gained some of those contextual features, then we start to interfere with it by adding in purposeful variability, where we're using different pitches. We're having them shoot from different points on the basketball court. We're having them going through 3 different derivatives of Olympic lifting in a sequence rather than just one at a time, right? Build context, then interfere with it. That seems to be the formula for learning better than one or the other.
That's good, Nick. Can I go back to the variability a little bit? And you said that's inherent. It's always going to happen. So, one of the things that came to mind is like a kettlebell swing. And I had clients even this morning doing kettlebell swings. So I guess my goal as a coach should never be for all of them to be exactly the same, because that's never going to happen, right?
You want the outcome that you're looking for. Let's say the end position,
okay,
give or take. You want that to look the same, because that end position probably biomechanically allows them to get the most out of the movement and is the safest for them. But when it comes to movements like the kettlebell swing or Olympic lifting, there is going to be some within and between subject variability. Conversely, if it's baseball, right, or it's tennis or it's golf, you want the ball to land in a very specific spot. So to your point, yes, there's always going to be a certain level of variability that you want that is going to be natural. Now, here's the thing. In track and field, they have this concept called style versus technique. And when they look at that, means when it comes to technique and running, I want my foot to strike under my center of mass at high speed, okay? So how I go about moving my leg in front of me to getting my foot under my body, that might happen many different ways for different heights of athletes, different speeds of athletes, so on and so forth. So in that case, their difference in style is not impeding their technique because they're all striking under their body. But if any of those individuals had a style, right, where they really reached and pulled the ground, whereby they struck way in front of their center of mass, then in that case we'd say that their style is negatively impacting their technique. Thus there's performance decrement and injury risk. We need to make a change. So I think it's within every coach's remit, when they're looking at the movements they're teaching, they have to create, if you would, the bandwidth of acceptability and style, right, that allows the same technical features to be achieved. But once they feel that there's critical technical pieces that either enhance performance or potentially reduce injury, if those are not being achieved, then that's where they really need to step in and say the individual variability is not healthy at this point. We need to make a change.
Guys, this is gold right now. We could probably stop it right here. This is good. Nick, I want to go back again to contextual interference. And the image I had too is, sometimes we have clients or athletes come in and let's say they've been squatting for a while. So it's not that they're necessarily new to the movement, but maybe they're doing it incorrectly and we want to coach a little bit different. That's a place where we would want to use contextual interference, right? To kind of break that cycle a little bit and wake them up like, hey, no, you're kind of on autopilot in your squat right now. We need to make a change here.
Yeah, that's where I would definitely think of complexing your core squatting movement. Let's say it's a front squat, maybe with a variation of a goblet squat or a variation of an overhead squat, or maybe you're using just a very subtle instability in the surface, or maybe they usually squat in their shoes and you have them squat barefoot. Now you're not doing this in the front squat, but you're having them out of the front squat and you're having them start to groove the squatting pattern. And you wouldn't necessarily, you could argue that you're doing this for corrective reasons, but to be honest, guys, what you're really trying to do is increase what I call sensory equity. Okay? You are sitting there giving them cues, and you're realizing that none of these cues are making a difference. So then what I would encourage you to do is get them out of the front squat, get them a kettlebell, change the surface, try to come up with a task variation or an environmental variation that allows them to physically feel the change you are trying to induce. And then what you do is you tag a cue to that. So for example, if they're not as upright in their posture and they're dumping the bar forward, then you load the heck out of them, let's say with a goblet squat. And you are delivering cues as they feel that posture become more vertical and those hips sit deeper. Let's say they're dumping their knees in every time in a valgus position. So you put a heavy mini band around those knees, as we've all done, and you put a cue to that, right? Drive through the band. As you drive through that band, feel like you're almost splitting the floor. You feel that tension through your hips. Yeah, coach, I feel that. That's what I mean when I say spread the floor. So what we try to do is we bring literal sensory equity to the cues that you're delivering during the outcome skill. And if you use that in between the outcome skill, in this case a front squat, the movements themselves are acting as a form of contextual interference. You're getting better attentional investment because you have novelty, but you're also scaffolding what I call coaching context. So now they can take the cues from those simpler drills where they had some feeling and apply it back to the complex one you're trying to make better.
That's good. And that kind of leads into the next series where we're going to talk about instructions and verbal information. And, a lot of coaches, I feel like, started off giving internal focus cues. I remember, fire the glutes, all that. And just when you were talking right there, I could literally feel, everything lining up as you're saying, spread the floor and things like that. And now I think you and other people are bringing more focus on, hey, external focus cues are really the way to go. Can you just touch on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So, back in 1998, a German researcher named Gabrielle Wolf was getting her degree in motor learning, and she was learning how to windsurf. Like any good German PhD student, bought a book on how to windsurf and was reading the 8 lines of text on how to perform a turn, and was realizing that thinking in terms of 8 lines of text, right, and I might be embellishing just a bit there, she kept falling off the board, right? She wasn't effective at windsurfing. So what she did is she took all that information, she averaged it down, and realized all it was really saying was push through the board and, push the board out. And she averaged all of these internal cues into one external cue. And the sail grabbed the air, wind, and all of a sudden she made the turn. And it was a light bulb moment. And I love that story because it's true. And Dr. Gabrielle Wolf back in 1998 asked the question, does it matter how we deliver cues? Does it matter if the cue references the body, i.e. joints or muscles, head to heel stuff, right? Or should it reference the environment, the outcome, push the ground away, jump as high as you can, explode off the ground, sprint towards the fence? Were they equally efficacious or was one better than the other? And we can fast forward to today, 2016, and there's roughly, when I submitted my dissertation, I think I had 150 papers that were currently on this, and you cannot find one. You can't find one that will tell you that referencing the body that providing an internal cue has any efficacy for teaching people coordinated movement. So let me give you some examples of this in terms of bringing it to life for people. Internal cues oftentimes are worse than telling the person nothing at all. Okay?
Wow.
Internal cues actually cause choking when learning a new skill. Meaning if I coach you with internal cues and then I put a stress on you like, hey, someone's going to judge you, or someone's going to watch you, or you get paid if you do this better than the other participants. I introduce anxiety into the scenario. We know people that were coached with internal cues are more likely to choke than those coached with external cues. So all this evidence is showing that, gosh, internal cues increase your heart rate and reduce heart rate variability. So even at an autonomic nervous system standpoint, we're seeing that internal cues cause disruption. Internal cues cause increase in EMG activity and reduction in fluidity of motion. All the things that you're trying to avoid and progress out of as we learn a new skill. So we could go on it for days, but all we know, the evidence is there, is that internal cues really are not efficacious when it comes to teaching multi-joint coordinated movement. Now, where can you give an internal cue? Because I just want to level set. Obviously, if you're setting someone up for a squat or a deadlift, can you reference the body? Sure you can. Feet shoulder width apart, right? Chest up, stomach tight, all those kind of what I call setup cues, no problem. Because all you're trying to do is orient the person with the barbell, with the implement in space. Where internal, external cues become important is when you are cueing the dynamics of the movement itself, when you are cueing leg action, when you are cueing bar path, when you are cueing the hip hinge, whatever it might be. That's where we want to try to put the preference over giving external cues rather than internal cues. Now, if you're teaching a single joint exercise like a glute bridge, or you're working in a rehabilitation setting, and literally getting the muscle to fire is the goal, then absolutely, internal cue to your heart's content. If you're a bodybuilder and you want to work on specific muscle isolation, internal cue to your heart's content. Brad Schoenfeld, and I've talked to him about collaborating on a number of papers on this, is actually going to look at, is internal cueing better for hypertrophy? We don't know the answer to that question yet, but potentially. So it's not that internal cues are always bad, but they are always bad when you're trying to teach multi-joint movement with the sole purpose of improving coordination and movement efficiency. That's where we have to use external cues. Now, in my dissertation, and I've published this in a number of papers, and I'm going to publish it in scholarly journals in the next year, I've come up with a structure, or I shouldn't say I've come up with it, I've noticed the structure for external cues. And they follow the 3 Ds of distance, direction, and description. So let's use sprinting as an example to bring that to life. Every cue, every good cue typically has all 3 of these elements. It has a distance it encourages in the attention, it has a direction it encourages, and it has some level of descriptor that drives how you should go about doing the movement. So for example, if I tell someone to explode off the ground in the context of sprinting, well, exploding off the ground is close to me. Exploding off the ground is what we might call an away cue. I'm trying to get away from the ground. And explode provides context on how I should do it. I should do it very fast, right? Accelerate through it. Conversely, I could tell you to explode towards the gates. Well, now instead of telling you to get away from the ground, I'm telling you to go toward the set of gates in front of you. Instead of giving a cue that's close to the body, i.e. the ground, the cue's far away because the gates, let's say, are 10 yards in front of you. But in that case, the descriptor word is the same. It's explode. So what people need to understand is every time they give a cue, they can have these levers of, okay, the direction. I told them to snap the bar towards the ceiling. Now I'm going to tell them to snap or sit under the bar, right? The ceiling is far away. Sitting under the bar is close. Right, focusing on the ceiling is far versus just focusing on the bar in general is close. So we have these variables of distance and direction that I encourage people to play around with because at the end of the day, they are going to influence the movement differently in different people based on how that person processes information. And then similarly, the descriptors are action verbs, right? Explode, snap, push, drive. And the key thing for people to understand is you want the action verb, you want the descriptor to capture the biomechanical essence of the movement you are teaching. So just like you need to demonstrate at the speed with which you want them to perform, we need to cue to capture the essence with which we want them to perform. And the final bit of that is within that descriptor contains the ever so powerful world of analogy and metaphor. And we know that when we are cueing, if we cue using analogy, comparing something new to something they already know, it's kind of like this. Explode off the ground like a jet taking off, right? Or explode to the sky like a rocket taking off. Creating analogy and metaphor allows individuals to understand the complexity through the simplicity of experiences they've already had. And I think we can all reflect on great coaches we've experienced. They're storytellers. Mm-hmm. They use analogy and metaphor the same way a surgeon uses a scalpel. And I believe analogies and metaphors are supercharged external cues, and when possible, should be preferentially used over any other type of communication strategy when teaching movement.
That's good. Can we break down some of the movements that a lot of coaches are doing in the weight room, Nick, like the squat and the hinge, for example? What are some, good external cues that really can help us connect with the athlete?
Yeah. So when we talk about a squat, we need to first start to understand what are the errors that we're trying to correct. So when someone thinks about how to be effective at this, whether it's a squat, it's a lunge, or it's sprinting for that matter, I want them to kind of use a model of first identify what are the primary errors that I am trying to change. Select 2 to 3 of those. Once you know what those errors are, then we can start to apply this model. So let's say for squatting, we want to keep the knees out. That's one of the errors we want to get rid of, and we want to have a more upright body position. So when we talk about keeping the knees out, oftentimes we can say things like split the ground. But if splitting the ground for a given individual doesn't help them, then put a mini band around their knees. Literally introduce an environmental feature. And in doing so, now say, keep tension on that mini band. And you can utilize that cue even when the mini band isn't there. Hey, imagine you have a mini band around your knees. Push out through that imaginary mini band. If we talk about upright body position, we can literally tell them head to hip, right? We can tell them to keep that nice and straight, but we can turn that into an analogy. Imagine you have a bar, a piece of steel from head to hip, and we want to keep that nice and straight. Imagine from head to hip, your body is a chain. We want to keep all of those chain links as tight as possible. Imagine you have lasers coming out of your eyes. Give them a specific point on the wall. I want you to keep those lasers pointed straight ahead. When we talk about getting a better hip hinge, let's say, imagine that you have a belt on. I want you to try to fold over that belt as tightly as possible. Or I want you to focus on bowing forward, whatever it might be. Let's say we want hip position back a little bit farther. Literally put a chair behind them and say, I want you to sit back towards the chair. I want you to sit back and tap towards the chair, whatever it might be. Oftentimes, guys, to be honest with you, with the squat, we have to introduce other environmental features like a chair, like a mini band, like a kettlebell in a goblet sense, to help them understand some of these external cues that we're sharing here.
And those hinges are good too, because I find like a lot of people probably are a little bit better teaching the squat, but the hinge, I think for a lot of times people, and even, pretty good athletes, if they've never really done a deadlift or a hinge before, it can be a chore. And so these external cues will hopefully enable coaches to get those results quicker on that.
No, I mean, absolutely. So I think with things like the hinging, again, what we tend to find for a lot of people, as I have over the years, is whether it's if they have the mobility, having them hold a dowel physically against the head, the upper back, and the hip, that tends to start to build in some of that sensory equity to basically say, I want my body to feel like the dowel. Similarly, having an individual put that band kind of over their shoulder and then wrapping it down around the leg that's going back, let's say in the case of a single leg RDL, again, telling them to drive and keep tension through that band the entire time tends to be, quite helpful when it comes to learning the body position. I think the big issue with cueing, internal or external alike, is it goes back to a point I made earlier. They don't have sensory equity to understand how to apply the cue, right? Because we've all had the experience where a client looks at us and says, I know what you're asking me to do, I just don't know how to do it. And that's where cues by themselves, they're much more powerful when they're coupled with a physical experience, which is why I think Gray Cook and Lee Burton and a lot of individuals that have come up with clever corrective exercises, while there's benefit and value in the corrective exercise itself, I think one of the reasons a lot of those corrective exercises are so helpful is they do just that. They build sensory equity.
That's a great point. I never thought about it that way. What about some cues, external cues for the upper body movements like pushing and a pull?
So with most upper body movements, unlike a body weight squat, right, you have an implement. Mm-hmm. So the second you have an implement in hand, that needs to be the focus. Just like if you were swinging a golf club or swinging a baseball bat, you focus on the contact between the club and the implement, or even where that ball should go in space. I want people to do the same thing when it comes to the bar. So if it's a bench press, we talk about snapping the barbell towards the ceiling, or maybe giving an even more specific spot. Maybe there's something on the ceiling that's right above them to help with bar path. I want you to snap the bar up towards where those pillars cross. Make it as sensory fulfilling as possible, using the vision to help drive that. Focus on snapping or driving or exploding the bar away from the bench. Focus on driving down into the bench. Focus on pushing so hard that you are going to sink into the ground or into the bench. Try to use language, right, that's rich, that causes a visceral feeling. We could tell them, imagine that you are driving that bar through two walls, and you have to keep that bar as straight as possible as you drive it to the ceiling. Start to build a story around it. When we talk about pull-ups, literally we're telling them, pull the bar down into the ground, right? Try to, in this case, we might call this one an internal cue. Drive your elbows to your pockets, put your elbows in your pockets, right? That becomes almost, if you would, something that's fantastical. You're not literally telling them to flex the elbow or extend the shoulder. You're telling them to imagine your elbows are tennis balls. Put the tennis balls into the pockets. These might be silly, and people might be thinking, Nick, you're freaking crazy. But when people start laughing, laugh means that they're listening, because they wouldn't have laughed if they hadn't listened. Yeah. And the second we start laughing, there's chemistry going on in the brain that says, this is interesting. I want to remember this because this made me feel good, right? So that's where anytime, and I tell people this, anytime you have an internal cue and you just don't know how to come up with an external cue, let's go ahead and use an analogy. So let me give you an example back to the squat, okay? So we see a flex spine all the time. So someone might say chest up or flat back, okay? An external cue might be stretch the front of your shirt, stay long through the squat. I find both of those to be very boring. Or we could say from head to hip, imagine your body is a chain being pulled in both directions, as I said earlier. Or from head to hip, imagine your body is a nail. Don't bend the nail, right? Because we all have experienced hitting a nail and it bending and it not working too well. So again, you can see how internal cues, not going to work. External cues, fun but boring, but analogies. Make it something relatable and you got them.
That's really good. What about if we're trying to just do a core exercise, specifically like an isometric one? So I'm thinking about how to relate bracing and that effect to people.
Yeah. Oftentimes with bracing, people talk about being stiff like steel. Again, using language that creates some rhythm. Stiff like steel is easy to remember. Tabletop, head, upper back, and hip will literally put a foam roll on them, a long foam roll, and say, stay long like the foam roll. So I think a lot of those cues, guys, though, are more for alignment purposes. And to be honest, when it comes to stiffening, I think cueing breathing. Still the old adage of pulling the belly button up and in. I still find that in certain cases for bracing movements, that's not a bad cue, especially if it's an isometric. And, if we want to turn it into an external cue, brace as if you're about to take a punch, right? Imagine that your rib cage and your hips are 2 blocks. Stack the blocks on top of each other. Align the blocks together on the ground. Whatever it is, we can turn the body into kids' blocks, into puzzle pieces, and instantly any of these internal cues can be external. There's not a lot of risk involved. They're isometric. So I think for a lot of the tension pieces, play around with breathing out, stacking ribs over hips to create that symmetry, or in DNS we call the closed scissor position. And you can use internal cues for bracing, or say, imagine you're about to take a punch, brace in. And teach the Valsalva maneuver. I think in there you have a little bit more flexibility in your cueing, but even just right there in my short little narrative on it, you can use both.
Let's go a little bit more dynamic, Nick. So, for instance, just this morning I was working with an athlete who demonstrated valgus with squat, and over the course of us working, she's gotten through that. But as soon as we go more dynamic and get her doing jumping activities, that all kind of goes out the window.
Yeah.
What do you do different when it comes to those more dynamic movements?
So again, I think when it comes to dynamic movements like a counter movement jump or a continuous type jumping, and I see someone with a really big issue with valgus at the knee, I still think there's merit in utilizing a mini band, a very light mini band, to cue that feeling of keeping everything aligned, especially if it's a large valgus moment. If it's a very tiny valgus moment, I don't know if I'm going to get overly concerned. If you watch enough athletes squat and jump, a little bit of valgus creates a stretch reflex in the hip complex, and that is a natural way to get increased torque at the hip and thus increased power. But obviously, if the knees are caving in, we want to get rid of that. Another way, to be honest, is I don't want them jumping on a Bosu ball. I don't want them to be on an incredibly unstable surface. But if I had my way, if on flat ground I see a lot of valgus, I'd want to put them in sand. The second I put them in sand, obviously I know they're in a softer surface, so it's going to dampen the landing, not a lot of risk there. But also in doing so, it increases the variability at takeoff. And an increase in the variability at takeoff, I have to start to strategize, right? I have to start to self-organize in a manner that optimizes my ability to express force. So if someone's caving in at the knees, we all know that that's not going to be an effective way to jump high. So oftentimes the self-correction will be to have greater alignment of the hip, the knee, and the ankle. Thus, I'm able to jump higher. So I think being able to utilize a surface that encourages greater force production and greater control of the movement underpinning that force production would be 2 very effective ways. So you could potentially have them do some jumping barefoot if they were on a soft surface. I don't want this to turn into an issue with soft tissue. Okay, but mini band for me would be another way. Or I would also have them hold a medicine ball while they do the jumping. I'd venture to say if they're caving in at the knees, that's then going to be associated with an overly flexed posture, right? Kind of that ACL position of no return. I would venture to say if I have them hold a medicine ball, that's going to create an anterior moment of flexion, meaning the glutes are going to have to work harder to keep me in that same position. So if the medicine ball, by the nature of holding it, increases tension and activation in the glutes, I should have greater stability, hopefully, in controlling my knee position, reducing the risk that the knees are going to go in. So hopefully that provides some examples. You really have to know the biomechanics you're trying to encourage and either manipulate it with language, and if language fails you, then manipulate the task or the environment. Yeah. Ball in hand, mini band around the knees, those are kind of task manipulators. Changing the surface to encourage alignment and force production, that's an environment.
I think that's good, Nick, because I think that maybe the internal cues are from coaches knowing the anatomy, but I liked how you said they need to know the biomechanics. And so maybe shifting our minds to think that way and think, okay, what result do I want? What biomechanics have to happen, instead of focusing on the anatomy and getting caught up in all the muscles. Maybe that will help with the cueing as well.
I think that is a subtle but incredibly important point. I don't think I've ever thought of it in that way. No, I think well said. Very well said.
Cool. So what is the key to starting and finishing instructions to make sure they're successful? I like how you talk about this.
When we talk about instructions, every bit of instruction and feedback, it's all instruction at the end of the day. So this is also for your feedback piece. I think the key thing is this. Number one, you have to understand the difference between natural movement variability and a true movement error. Okay? So the first point around being successful in your instruction is instructing the right thing. Okay? That oftentimes is a point that's not seen. And because I talk about motor learning, and I'm not always talking about biomechanics, we still have to be technicians. We still have to understand what needs to be cued before we go in with our language. So, as I said earlier, you must be able to see the movement for what it is, understand the biomechanics, prioritize the top error, and pick the top error that you feel, if change, is going to make the biggest difference. Once you have done that, then we need to introduce the language that we feel is going to be most effective. And in doing so, that's our external cues, that's our analogies. Now, if language fails us, that's where we have to start looking at our practice design piece, whereby we manipulate the task. We give them a medicine ball, a mini band around the knees. We manipulate the environment. We change the surface. We add a weight vest to their body, whatever it might be. And if we go through this process of analyze, prioritize, and cue, and we continue to go through that cycle, and we use the feedback from the next repetition. Did it make a difference? If it didn't, then we try a new cue or a new variation of cue or a new variation of a drill. So I know you want something more specific than that, so maybe you can give me a follow-up question and I can dig deeper around instruction.
No, that's good, because that actually leads into the two types of feedback that we can help with the learning process, the task intrinsic and then the augmented feedback.
Yes. So when it comes to feedback, first thing we have to understand is, again, what are we providing feedback to? Is it the most important variable? How are we providing that feedback, right? Utilizing our language, external cues. And then the next one is, how often are we providing it? And that's going to get to this point. So back in the 70s, they asked this question: how often should one give feedback to optimize motor learning? And what they found was 33% of the time. If you give feedback every third repetition, that is going to drive learning, skill acquisition, and retention significantly better than if you give feedback after every single repetition. And this was bucketed into something called the guidance hypothesis, whereby there was a belief that has evidence now to back it up, that if you provided a cue every single time, the learner, the athlete, the client becomes dependent on that information. And thus they literally cannot think or act for themselves in the absence of it. So that's where making the recommendation of only giving a cue or only giving feedback every third repetition is a really, really good recommendation, because 2 out of 3 times they get to work on self-correcting, self-reflecting, thinking about all the coaching that they have heard and received and movements that they have felt and experienced, and start to come up with their own solutions. And we want to create an autonomous mover, if you would. Now, fast forward in the last 10 years, they've done another line of research that looks at the same thing, but we call it self-controlled feedback. So what I mean by that is they take a bunch of people who are learning a new movement, and they say, let us know when you want feedback. And it could be feedback on the outcome, feedback on the process. It could be, hey, can you demonstrate that movement again? We're kind of allowing the learner to drive the learning process. And what's interesting about that is, when learning a new movement, people typically ask for feedback 9 to 30% of the time. Oh, well, guess that number pops up again. So it seems that even with a new learner, again, it's a puzzle. They don't want feedback every single time. My child doesn't want me to do the puzzle for them, only wants them to help them out when they need a bit of help. And they'll let me know. My child will let me know when he or she cannot figure it out. No problem. And tell me just as equally, Dad, get away, I got this. Anyone who has kids gets that. Yeah. So why does that matter to your question? Well, here's why it matters. task intrinsic feedback are things that are inherent to the athlete, meaning the athlete already knows it or the client already knows it. So if an athlete fails on a lift, no one needs to tell them that. If a basketball player misses a shot, no one needs to tell them that. If an athlete trips or stumbles, no one needs to tell them that. So task intrinsic information is any information that you know the athlete already has. And that's also, if you've given them a cue a million times, they're going to start to increase their task intrinsic knowledge. And that should be intuitive for most. So one way you decrease the amount of stuff you say is never telling them something to the best of your ability that you know they already know. So never provide feedback, never provide instruction around things that are task intrinsic, that are inherent to the skill itself. Do your best to provide feedback around elements, features, movements, errors, thoughts, attitudes that you know are not inherent, that are not already known by the athlete or the client. That's really what the whole concept around task intrinsic feedback is, and is meant to influence, or really for me influences how often we cue. Try to avoid giving task intrinsic feedback because it's already inherent to the skill. Now, augmented feedback comes in two forms. What we call knowledge of results versus knowledge of performance. So knowledge of results would be, this is how fast you ran over 10 meters. This is your shooting percentage in the last 10 shots, right? It's an actual data point, right? This was your range of motion you achieved on a given skill. This is how much weight you lifted. Versus knowledge of performance oftentimes is much more qualitative. It has to do with the movement process itself. So it might be, hey, you didn't quite get enough hip extension on that last repetition. I want you to focus on exploding or driving off the ground a little bit faster and a little bit longer. So when it comes to motor learning, knowledge of performance and knowledge of results, both are really, really important for teaching. A general rule is this: when you're working with a novice who doesn't know what they're doing, right? The outcome isn't even that important at this point. How fast my athlete runs the first day they show up, sure, I want to know that. But the first thing that I'm working on with them is their quality, the quality of movement. Once they have the quality of movement, then we're going to start to emphasize the expression of that at higher speed, higher intensity, and thus the outcome comes into light. Conversely, as I just noted, when you've been working with someone for a long time, starting to help them calibrate the performance with the outcome becomes critical. So that way I can tell my athlete, listen, that last rep was a 159 over 10 yards for sprinting. He or she immediately starts to know, okay, that's what 159 feels like. And I can, moving forward, just give him or her that time, and then they can start to self-correct. So inevitably what that does is, as you spend more time giving knowledge of results, it puts the ownership of the process, the movement performance, back in the athlete's hands. So at the end of the day, it's not one or the other, but it's understanding how knowledge of results, knowledge of performance around features that are not inherently known by the athlete or client themselves, those are some of the key elements to feedback. And at the end of the day, use external cues to deliver the message, and do it about 33% of the time, you're going to be nails on teaching.
Nick, this is incredible. I got so many pages of notes in front of me. I'm sure our listeners do too. And, you know, you're hitting at the core thing that really makes a great coach, right? Can you communicate? Can you get your athletes to change? It doesn't matter all the programming and the science and all that stuff if you can't communicate at the end of the day. So thank you so much for being a trailblazer in this part of our field, you know, going out there, getting your PhD and pushing this part of our field forward. I think we're all better for it. I just really appreciate your time here.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you guys doing this. I have such deep respect for those that dedicate and take their time to reach out to other professionals and curate all that information and share it back in a digestible form, because it's only through great questions do you get interesting answers that move us forward. So thank you guys.
That's good. And Nick, can you end up with where people can connect with you?
Yeah. So the best places to reach me, one would be Twitter. So at Nick Winkelman, NickWinkelman. I put really, as thoughts are running through my head, that's where I put them. So that's where you get fresh information and updates on anything that I'm doing. Also, I keep my Facebook up to date, as well as if you friend me on LinkedIn, I'm happy to accept as many people as possible. So LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook are kind of the three different places that I rest my head.
Perfect. And we'll have all those notes on the page as well. Nick, thanks again so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.